Back in the year 2001, early 2001, I read a novel by Dave Barry called Big Trouble. I had been reading Dave Barry's column in the Miami Herald. It got republished in the Las Vegas Review Journal for a long time. By that point, even though I was only 16 years old, my parents were big fans of his, and so I tended to read his column, and I got a sense for his style of humor. He was branded as a humorist. And then naturally, when he wrote his first novel, I was very excited to check it out. My friend Derek had a copy, he loaned it to me, and I made the mistake of trying to read it during the sustained silent reading portion of English class junior year. And at one point, I had to close the book and put it down and just clamp my hand over my mouth and try to stop myself from laughing out loud just because I was having such a good time reading it. Later that year, the book would be adapted into a movie. It was scheduled for a late September release. And then something happened in early September that necessitated the delay of that release. Namely, that the third act of this comedic caper/thriller novel deals with hijacking an airplane. And this was the year 2001. People got really sensitive about that really fast. And so the movie was delayed for about 6 months. And then when it finally came out, my friends and I went to the theater and saw it. And it was fine. But at that point, well, let me get into it. The book is, it's written really in the vein of an Elmore Leonard type thriller. But there are also, obviously the signature comedy of Dave Barry is there, but there are other recognizable components that put it together. There is a huge cast of characters in this book, but they are almost always paired off. There's two of everybody. The main character is a guy named Elliot. There's Elliot and his son. Elliot is a divorced advertiser. He used to work for a newspaper, but he got fired. Now he's trying to run an advertising agency and not going so well. Elliot's son is in love with a girl named Jenny. Jenny's mom is married to a guy named Arthur, who's an absolute jerk and is involved with local organized crime. There are two cops named Walter and Monica. There are two hitmen. There are two random mall cops that show up. His son has got his best friend. There are two local criminals named Snake and Eddie. It just goes on and on and on. There are always these pairs of characters that pop up, largely doing the same thing, but they provide foils for each other, and really, I think, are used as instruments for Dave Barry to tell jokes. So as all these people are crossing paths with each other, there are these two hitmen that are trying to kill Jenny's stepfather because of the organized crime ties that he has. There are also a pair of Russian arms dealers disguised as local bar owners, and they end up pawning off a nuclear weapon on Arthur Herc, the bad guy. He just thinks that it's a missile, and he's going to use it to bribe his organized crime contacts because they sent hitmen after him. It's a comedy of errors until it becomes something else entirely in the third act. The two bad guys, Snake and Eddie, decide to rip off Arthur because he came onto their radar, and they're just two-bit low-life scum. They steal the briefcase that has the nuke in it, thinking that it's full of cash, and then they try to get on an airplane, and other parties are involved at this point, and you can see how it just goes absolutely sideways from there. In the movie, Elliot was played by Tim Allen, which makes sense because you'd want somebody with comedic chops in a comedic role. However, I don't think that the effect worked all that great, because I think that Elliot worked better just as a regular guy, as the straight man, and not somebody who had comedic chops. He was kind of accidentally funny because of the way that the narration was written. But Dave Barry's comedy works that way. You have to be the one reading it. You have to be immersed in it. And it doesn't always translate to a screen treatment. In my opinion, this was one of the flaws of the movie, is that it tried almost too hard to be faithful to the book, which is an odd complaint for a lore guy like me to make. But basically, it used the book as a script. Almost every line of dialogue from that movie was in the book. And the jokes that were stuck in the narration by the third-person omniscient narrator, ended up being narrated by Tim Allen's character, Elliot. To the effect that if you had read the book, there was nothing to surprise you in the movie. Surprise is a key element of comedy. So the movie then largely became an instrument for people who had not seen the book. And I think that worked against it in terms of its box office success. It had a lot going for it otherwise. I can't remember the name of the director. It's Barry Sonnenfeld. He's the guy who directed the first Men in Black movie. But in addition to Elliot being played by Tim Allen, you had Rene Russo as the lady love interest. The kids were played by a young Ben Foster and Zooey Deschanel in what I think was her first big film role, although she had a couple of other comedy roles around that time. Arthur Herc, the bad guy, was played by Stanley Tucci. The two cops were played by Janine Garofalo and Patrick Warburton, who's just gold in everything he's in. The two hitmen, one of them was played by, I'm going to forget this guy's name off the top of my head. The two-bit thieves were played by the late Tom Sizemore and Johnny Knoxville, and this was Johnny Knoxville at the kind of the peak of his Jackass fame. It just goes on and on, like everywhere you turn, even with the little cameos and bit parts. Like there's this mall cop who fancied himself as a Miami Vice type cop, and he was played by Andy Richter. So there's just recognizable faces and good actors everywhere in the movie. I just wish that the overall effect had been better and that they'd found a way to like really adapt the book instead of just using the book as a play-by-play thing for the movie itself. But overall, it worked. It did its job. It's just one of those movies where the book is definitely better. If you've never read anything by Dave Barry, whether it's his columns, his nonfiction, or he's even done a couple of middle grade books that are based on Peter Pan, if you've never read anything by him, you're in for a treat. However, I'll give you the same warning that he does at the beginning of the book, where he emphasizes that the book itself contains adult language. And he even kind of tongue-in-cheek says that I tried to ask the characters not to talk this way, but they're based in Miami, where he's lived for his entire life, and they're largely connected to the seedy criminal underground thereof, and characters in that environment talk a certain way, and it's just, you're dealing with crummy guys. They're not going to say, oh, darn, I don't like you. They're going to say other things. And so for people who were largely expecting something on tone with his newspaper columns, well, you can do things in a book that you can't do in the newspaper, and wham bam bibbidi bam, that's the end result. So there's plenty of language and there's a sensual situation near the third act centered on the bad activity of the two-bit criminal actors. Nevertheless, it was a hilarious book when I read it. I wonder if it would hold up to a similar reading now. He had another book that came out after that. I can't remember what it was called, but he was more or less trying to achieve the same thing, and he largely did it with the same mechanisms. There were characters that were paired up or that were in trios all the time, and you'd spend a couple of chapters with this group and this group and this group and this group. There are 5 or 6 focuses in this ensemble, and then they all end up together on a party boat out in the Atlantic, and then a hurricane hits, and it's 10 things going wrong all at once. Again, I refer you to it being a comedy of errors. He wrote that. He wrote it a couple of times. He wrote it well, but I think the first showing was probably the better of the two. If you've ever seen Big Trouble, and you might have, it's probably been on TV, and heaven knows I haven't checked any streaming services, but it's probably on one of those somewhere. You could probably find it and get through the story rather easily. The jokes are there, but I do recommend checking it out in print. Just be aware of the language and so on and so forth. But let me know what you think. Till next time, drive safe. See you out there.